And as you will see, we have two very experienced specialists in peace building, bridge building, interreligious dialogue, and related endeavors. And I'm going to give a brief introduction, and then each of them will speak in turn. But we're really looking forward to your questions. So when the time comes, please be formulating questions that you think might be of interest to the rest of the attendees. On your far left is Charles Randall Paul. Randall is the founder and president of the Foundation for Religious Diplomacy. He's also the chairman and founder of an organization called World Table. He is on the board of editors for the International Journal of the executive board for the Society for Mormon Philosophy and Theology, which he and I both serve on. And he is also a friend and partner of UVU, serving on our Interfaith Community Advisory Council. Randall, thank you for being here. To your right is Michael Goode, who is an associate professor of history here at Utah Valley University. He is an historian of early American and Atlantic history with a focus on encounters between peoples of indigenous European and African descent. Related areas of study for him include religion and political culture, Native American history, slavery and abolition, and peace history. As you'll most likely hear, he has experience on the ground in peace building activities, and he is the co-editor of the volume The Specter of Peace, Rethinking Violence and Power in the Colonial Atlantic. So please join me in welcoming them, then we'll turn the time directly over to Dr. Paul, and we'll go from there.
Those of you who were here this morning for the first presentation will appreciate what was said about the inertia of change, or of motion and direction, and how difficult it is to change even your own habits in life, let alone your family mores, and then talk about society, where you've got a very big shift. And we can all get very frustrated, especially as young people coming into our society, to say, why the heck hasn't, why don't these guys get it? And so with that background, they also said this morning that it takes just persistent pushing at the edge, continually pushing at the edge, in a way, in language, that allows new thoughts to come out of old words, where you're creating, again, a new way of looking at yourself and what's possible. The human imagination pushing things into actualization. That's what it's all about. And so I see myself as someone in the last 20 years of my life, at least, has been trying to talk about old words in new ways. I'm not a continental philosopher, and I don't want to be too obscure today, but I'm going to be talking about peaceful tension as the goal, not peace. I'm going to talk about things like having a trustworthy rival and imagining what that might be. I'm going to be talking about not peaceful coexistence, but peaceful co-resistance, collaborative contestation. Okay? If you put those words down and leave here today, you'll kind of get what this dude is trying to say. Try to get us to think about it in terms of new ways of living in a pluralistic world. So I'm going to first kind of punch at the secularist hypothesis a little bit, not to say that those things, secularism isn't very much happening in the Western world in a big way. Charles Taylor has a sophisticated way of talking about secularism, but I just want to give the first part of my spiel here will be to convince you all, persuade you at least, that religiousness is momentum in and of themselves to create conflicts between them in the world today. And to put some meat on the bone, the collective actions are required for human flourishing. There's no doubt about it. And globalization has accelerated the urgency for making very fraught collective decisions. Primarily, I see bioengineering of new or expanded life forms, what it means to be human, in other words, and also climate calamities as being prime issues, even more important than nuclear bombs, in my opinion, that will be facing our generations to come. These issues are informed by the religious or ideological views of human purpose and a destiny that cannot ever be resolved by overt evidence that is acceptable to all. As we said earlier today, religious conflicts have different aspects, but the one I like to focus on is the unresolvable aspect of conflicts over our purpose and destiny that have no way of finding a common metric that will allow for a consensus. We talked about John Rawls this morning. He believes we can live well with this overlapping consensus. I say that only goes so far. You'll often hear people say it's what unites us that's more important than what divides us, and I say no, it's more what divides us more important than what unites us. That's where the action is. That's what makes it. I mean, that's why you are you and not someone else. That we are all humans. That we all, eat and poop. Doesn't mean that we're going to have world peace. We have to face the fact that it's our differences, who we love and don't love, who we deal with, who we want to become versus what someone else wants to become. That's where the action of life, I believe, is. And part of this whole skill development for me is we need to, like I talked about this morning, we need to face the wholeness of each other, finding overlapping areas, sure, but always interested in that radical difference that we bring to the table and how we deal with that in a way that isn't, I'm okay, you're okay, but more or less, I am convinced that you ought to be more like me. And I can sense you're convinced that you think I ought to be more like you. And is that arrogance? Or is that sincerity? Think about it. If it's sincerity and not arrogance, we have a world then of radical difference where we're all persuaders in our own way. It's not just pass me the salt, please, but it's my lifestyle, my belief system is out there. It exudes from me. And it calls into question yours. And guess what? Yours does mine too. And so we're living in this tension. Do we make it a tension that is negative? Tension that is so scary that we have to literally not engage our rival worldview holders? Or is it a tension that allows us also a collaborative attraction that brings us together in what we call respectful modes of mutual persuasion? All right, so we've got these problems ahead of us. How on spaceship Earth, how in the world are we going to be able to face the problem of people who want to bioengineer human beings that are smarter than all of us and that go beyond what we would ever even call a human? Are we going to put them in a jail if they do it? Are we going to kill them if they do it? How about those of you who are so concerned about the future of our environment that it comes to a point where, hey, you realize if we all don't do it now, we're toast. We all got to do it now or we're toast. Well, these guys aren't doing it. They don't see the world that way. These guys have an eschatology that says, hey, God's in charge. No matter what we do, it's good. Or these guys that say, or guys, I'm talking guys, generic term, right? That say, no, it's really obvious that science says X or the world's going to be trash. Well, if they don't do it, do we force them to do it? And how do you force people to do something like that, right? How do you force people to save the world if you know there's only one way to save it? That's what you're about to face in your generations to come, are those really radical problems that are based in beliefs that can't be proven to be right or wrong generally. Okay, I've set the case for the importance of religious conflict, or religious conflicts in the future. Let me now just say, simply using a public health model, ideas, the liberal notion that ideas are somehow tame, right? That we can, as long as we don't put our noses in each other's physical spaces, we can just go along in our societies and really, everything will be cool. No, ideas are actually powerful things. And people who have convictions of strong ideas about the ultimate destiny of humanity are going to be in your mind, contaminating you and your kids. That contamination is just as powerful to some people as the virus was. And how did you feel? Maskers or non-maskers? That brought up this whole question. Holy smokes, this is air that we're all breathing together, and what you do matters to me. This is a deep model that we use, a public health model in our world today. Part of it, I work in the Middle East, and there's no question that they have this idea that, man, if they could just import our science, right, and our medicine, and not our filthy morals, they'd be really happy. But the West sneaks in with all this other stuff, the contaminating morals that they have. And so that's worse because it's going to keep us going to heaven, and we won't be fooled by materialism. We're going to fight this, stop this now, stop the contamination of falsehood that is taking people down. Now, in your own life, if you're say you're an atheist, and you've heard this before, religion is what's really caused all the problems in the world, right? Well, we gotta end this religion stuff if it's causing all the problems in the world. How do we do it? With better ideas that will really turn those believers into atheists, right? And that's what we need to do. Well, what does that sound like? That sounds like a missionary, right? And that's honestly what we all are if we look hard at the situation. We really want to influence others to do things that will be better for everyone from our point of view. So, we have, in these pluralistic times, come to the conclusion, both science and philosophy tend to agree that foundational nihilism, the idea that there is no purpose given by any God or nature to existence, that need not be a nauseating empty pit to look into, but rather an ever-opening mystery that lures us toward infinitely more questions. Goode, those of you who haven't studied this guy should study him at least at a superficial level. It's worth it. Goode's theorem has really influenced math, science, and is backed into, I think, philosophy and even religion. And he had the theorem, of course, that no system can be proven from within the system. No proof can be made that the system is true, completely correct, except by bringing a factor outside the system as part of the proof. And once you bring a factor from the outside into the system, you realize that factor existed in another system. So you run to get to that system to prove that that system is right. Well, all of a sudden you're in an infinite regress or progress of finding systems on top of systems, none of which can be ultimately proved. Which puts us in this idea then that whatever truth is, or whatever human knowledge is, or whatever we're doing in that sense, is always tentative and always open to correction, always, right? And for those of you who come from either an rationality is the fundamental reality. There is some kind of logical reality there that we can all count on. You'll be disappointed to hear that. Those of you who are religiously oriented toward a final absolute reality in some divine finality, you might be disappointed to hear that. But that is a pragmatic system that we're in right now that is, I think, very useful to engaging in religious conflict, to admit to each other that at least as humans right now, we are all in a position that is tentative and that is partial. So we can be convicted, but always open to learn more. And that openness to learning more might mean our convictions will change. It's like marrying someone and saying, I'll be yours forever. You know, but realize that the moment you say that, you are going to be changing and growing as a person. And your spouse is going to be changing and growing as a person. So, what are you committing to? You're committing to a dynamic relationship, right? You're not committing to a fixed and final person or ideal. And that is a very important notion that we found in working in our religious conversations that are what we call unresolvable, in that we both parties that are coming to the table with their differences are open to learning more about their own views as well as those of others. And that openness allows for a certain humility to exist, and it damps down the tendency to be so firm that as if you need to defend God. Well, who are you to defend God? God needs no defense, right? You're just this wimp. But we get ourselves into that mode, or who are you to defend the Enlightenment, right? But if the Enlightenment, the rationality is true in and of itself, it needs no defense, right? But if we are both humbly saying, we're trying to work this out together, I'm convinced of this, and I'm not going to be disloyal to it, but I am open to learn more, and if both sides say that, all of a sudden the social psychological reality of the moment is one of collaborative contestation, where you contest, from your point of view, the highest ideals, or the highest way forward, and the other person does the same, and attempting mutual persuasion. Now, you probably get what that might lead to. What the Goode theory is, it never ends. So why the heck would you bother sitting down with someone who's convinced of their worldview, convinced that you're contaminating the world with your wrong worldview? Why would you bother to try to persuade that person to change? Because you're convinced they won't. Why are you convinced they won't? Because you're convinced you won't, right? And so you projected that. So what the heck, why bother? Let's go to the movies, or let's just agree on feeding the poor, or let's find just a few things that we can agree on. The problem is when the stuff hits the fan, as I'm saying it will be, and it always has, it comes down to the problem of your deepest beliefs being in conflict. And then we have something that has to develop, or we will end up in violence. And that, 2 minutes. And the violence, and so we have found in all our work, and I'm working in Iran right now, and in the United States, at the level of track 2 diplomacy, we call it, where people learn to engage between each other at this kind of level of honest contestation. The goal, again, is to come out of those relationships where you see someone as an idiot, or someone as benighted, or someone who is duped, or maybe someone who is downright evil, right? That you go into that conversation and you come out of it convinced that they're not stupid, they're not duped, right? They're not evil. They might be going to hell still, but you're not happy about it, right? You're not happy. You feel differently about that person because of the engagement. You see yourself in that person. And so this idea of a mutual influence is not necessarily a intellectual agreement, but it's a mutual influence of heart and mind desire to remain in this contestational life that needs and actually desires a bothersome opponent. That's the nudge that we've got to get to. Peaceful tension only can come when we desire bothersome rivals to be part of our lives. And those of you who are resisting marriage understand what I'm talking about. A marriage partner is a bothersome rival as well as someone that you can cherish and love. And that's deeply true. But I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Okay, I'll try to keep my comments somewhat brief. As Brian alluded to, I wear two hats. One hat I wear is I'm an historian. The second hat that I wear is I'm involved in peace studies. I've done work on the ground. In 1999 through sort of 2005, I've worked in the West Bank on a violence reduction project, working with Israeli and Palestinian human rights activists, addressing issues that are related to the Israeli military occupation of Palestinian territories. I was also in Colombia. I worked with communities that were threatened by our armed groups. And so I'm not going to address that. And if you wanted to query my experience in that, I'd be happy to address that in the Q&A. I guess I just wanted to sketch out a case about my work, thinking both as an academic and as someone who's been involved in peace building, what peace and nonviolence means to me personally. I'm not here to try to persuade you or talk you into becoming a pacifist. This is just more me thinking out loud. So these are not sort of settled concepts for me. Interestingly enough, I'm an historian, and historians are not represented in peace studies. The field has been conceded to other disciplines. It is without exaggeration. It is not without exaggeration. I can firmly say that historians could care less about peace, and that's partly because there is a sense that peace means an absence of violence. This is the sort of the kind of cliched view of peace. In other words, in philosophical terms, it's negative peace. And so think about historically, even in early American history, what is central in early American history? Slavery and colonization. And a study of early American history is a study of violence. And so in that sense, and that's absolutely true. So in that sense, why would you study peace? Doesn't make any sense. So that's where my colleagues stand. And I think they're wrong. Because peace is a discourse. It's an engagement with the problem of violence. Peace is a projection of power. You can have the king's peace, a slaveholder's peace. You might argue that that's not peace, right? And I would agree with you. But the question is, historically and in the modern world, peace for whom and peace on what terms? So peace is an ordering that can use often horrific violence to achieve something that a group of people or an individual deems to be ideal. And that is, why is that tied to, that doesn't sound like peace, does it? How is that tied to peace? Because this projection of power to create this ordering is believed to be to create for that community, whoever's conceiving this, again, I'm speaking in general terms, they're thinking of this as, this is the way that will create the most harmony in the world. And often this creates more violence. But peace is also an engagement with the problem of violence and how to limit violence. And the modern term, which I think is a little bit more useful, but it's still problematic, is nonviolence. But this is an awful term as well, because what is nonviolence? Nonviolence just says not violence, and it doesn't really get at what these things are. So I'm left with a really terrible problem with trying to talk about something in which the terms that are used in the field, say peace building or nonviolence, are inadequate, problematic, or poorly used. So what is underneath these terms? Underneath these terms, the heart of it is building relationships. And that can run on a spectrum. And that building relationships means at the minimal trying to create a situation where violent conflict, where people are seeking to murder each other. Or it could be other forms of violence. Violence is also something that is open to definition, right? One definition, obvious definition of violence is engaging in physical harm, to destroy somebody physically. But structural violence can include all sorts of other things. Destroying somebody's identity, annihilating somebody's culture, value systems. That also is violent. And so the problem of like violence reduction is complicated, and at the minimum, nonviolence is addressing how to create situations where violent conflict is de-escalated to a point where people are not routinely killing each other or routinely engaging in practices that seek to annihilate the other. And there are many different examples of how that can play out on the ground. But then on the other end of the spectrum, it's moving towards some kind of equilibrium where people are learning to live with one another. And that doesn't mean, of course, embracing each other's worldviews or making friends. Nonviolence is not about being nice. Nonviolence is about engaging in collective action. Nonviolence is, as a movement, is engaging in the use of force. So let me make that very clear. Has two goals. It is about creating spaces where different peoples can maybe live together without killing each other at a minimum. But I think more fundamentally addressing, authentic nonviolence, if there's such a thing, is geared towards addressing structural violence. And you cannot create a situation in which people can live together without addressing structural violence. And the classic example of, what is the difference between violence and structural violence? If I'm walking down the street and somebody pulls a gun at me and robs me, that's not structural. That can be an act of violence, but it's not structural violence. Structural violence are the systems and structures that create oppressions for people. And that can, again, there's a wide range of things. If you think of systemic racism, systemic oppression of LGBTQ peoples, those are all sort of fundamental forms of structural violence. I mean, there's other forms, but I think you get my point. So nonviolence is about addressing that. If you're not addressing structural violence, then you're wasting your time. Because essentially structural violence is what creates violent conflict. And I'll conclude, I guess, on this note. Both armed conflict and nonviolence, and I'm just speaking from my field experience, produces mixed results. And I think that the world in which we live in, which is heavily militaristic, there's an assumption that armed conflict will get you what you want, and it doesn't. It gets you some of what you want, but it doesn't get you everything that you want, and it often has outcomes that are unintended. The same is true for nonviolent initiatives. So both nonviolence and sort of armed struggle in various scenarios, because I'm generalizing, create mixed results, but I would argue, and then I just have to leave it on a provocative argument in a way without substantiating, but I would argue that nonviolent initiatives are more sustainable in the long run. In the long run, but that's a question of time horizon. But the choice really is up to you, whether you agree with that or not.
Thank you. Okay, we'll open it up for Q&A. We've got roving microphones. We want to make sure that we get as many questions in as possible. So please state your question succinctly and surrender the microphone to one of our staff people once you've asked your question. I want to start off by having each of you just briefly zero in on what you see and also perhaps identify a key point of divergence.
Yes, a little contestation. I really enjoyed that. What key, I think where we certainly have overlapping consensus would be on what you were saying at the end. William James would have agreed completely with Thomas Sowell on the idea there are trade-offs. To be educated, if you come out of this university without this great belief, then you're not educated, according to Thomas Sowell, which is, there's nothing but trade-offs. No matter what you do, you'll find that there's no perfect anything, right? And William James said, no good deed can be judged until we weigh the cries and the moans of the wounded in its wake. He was very eloquent. So trade-offs all the way down. And that's what I get out of this idea that you're saying. And also, I think I really loved what you were saying when you said, we need a new positive word for nonviolence. The fact that it doesn't exist, and I've studied this, in any society that I've found, and I've worked with people of various societies, there is no positive word for nonviolence. That's a very interesting thing. My colleagues and I have been working on something like ignition of desire for change in an adversary. You want to ignite the desire for change in an adversary. That's too many words. Anyhow, I want to just say thank you for that. It prompted me to think more about that.
I really don't have much to add. I guess the only one thing I would probably add is that maybe it's not helpful to think of nonviolence and violence in such antithetical ways. So our groups actually engage in nonviolent activities, and that there are many examples of this. And it just depends again how you define things, right? But it's these concepts are not antithetical. They're both embedded. You cannot talk about peace without violence, but you cannot talk about violence without peace, thinking about peace either.
I agree with that. And the work I do, everyone critiques it this way. There's a continuum between coercion and persuasion, right? And we can't deny that that's a fuzzy area, right? And I think that's another place where we would agree that it's just to say, as I try to say, mutual persuasion is the answer. Well, everyone will say, well, who's doing the persuading? How much power do they have compared to the other person? What are they, you can critique this stuff all the way down, right? Always. And that's what a great, I think, society does. It continues the contestation over any solution. It keeps it very much alive. That's the only way, I think, we can limit the violence, limit the force, because admit it's endemic in all of us.
Questions?
So my question is this. So imagine a scenario which has become all too common. Somebody walks in here with an AR and starts shooting people. And then, I'm pretty sure someone in here is concealed carry, right? Because this is Utah. That person pulls out a gun and shoots him. It seems pretty clear that the least violent thing to do in that scenario was what that person did. And so it seems to follow from that sometimes the least violent thing to do is actually armed conflict. And if structural violence, which I do believe exists, as somebody from the LGBT community who is actually under attack right now by structural violence. If the structural violence is bad enough, then it seems like armed resistance, armed revolt starts to become the least violent way of handling that situation. And I kind of wonder sometimes why we talk about nonviolence rather than least violence. It seems like life is itself violence. But I wonder what you think about those thoughts.
Thanks, Kelly. That's you know, in my perfect world, the guy with the gun has a great aim. So he hits the guy in both arms, so he's disarmed, and then everybody mobs him and takes him off. Right? That's a possibility, a good metaphor, right? Is just spill as little blood as possible, right? Teach us all how to spill as little, to limit the violence, the structural violence. There's no way of avoiding violence. I agree with you completely. So the goal has to be aware, to be engaged, to learn where we're hurting, where we didn't know. And then if you have an ethical community that cares at all, there might be some action. Now, in your extreme case, I don't know if you're a pacifist or not. I'm certainly not a pacifist. That's too extreme for me, pacifist. But the way to think about this, I think, is to admit that there are always limits. There are jails, right? There are jails. We've come up with a modus operandi, like we talked about in the first session, of norms, mores, things that almost go without saying, around which we create our laws. And those mores change over time, slowly, but they change over time. There are laws that change over time. And so, I can only say, if you're familiar with Chantal Mouffe and her work, or William Cullen O'Connelly and his, there's this idea of continual contestation between powers at all levels that you can engage with, hopefully less bloodshed. That's one goal, right? And that usually, from what you said, is a very pragmatic goal, because humans tend to be in violent cycles when there's bloodshed. They sense it's gone too far, therefore we've got to retaliate. And that is not, depending on what you're solving for, what your religious goal is, what your religious idea of the ideal society would be, probably violence needs to be limited, but engaged all the time in a contest, rather than a coercive moment.
Yeah, thank you. It's a great question. I don't have pat answers for it. So I think you're raising two issues. One is an issue of interpersonal violence, and one is an issue of structural violence. So again, I think what I tried to make clear at the beginning of the talk is that I'm not arguing about pacifism. So if somebody comes in here with an AR-15, please by all means shoot the person down. I'm not sitting here saying that you should just do nothing. Nonviolence, again, is not about do-nothingism. So there's discussion about things that be done with interpersonal violence, but that's, what I'm not saying is in this scenario, yeah, do nothing and let people die. That's not what I'm saying. That said, right, there's the other issue, which is structural violence. And then that gets more complicated because it's all these kinds of systemic forms of oppression and power. That includes interpersonal violence. And so then it becomes a question of like, what are the best tactics for social movements, for peoples to engage in to resist oppression? And then it becomes a choice, right? Armed violence, or nonviolent engagement, or some combination of the both. And those become strategic choices. And I just think that that's probably a different question than like somebody walking in the room with a gun, because that's a interpersonal violent moment that requires, it's an emergency, right? It's like somebody having a heart attack. And so like, so I would agree with you on stopping violence on both levels. It's just a question of how we best do it, and I think it's it's a muddy question. I think we live in a culture that is very, we're enculturated in a militaristic culture. So I think it's easy to come up with critiques of pacifism. I think it's harder for people, I'm not directing this to you, I'm just saying in general, to come up with critiques of violence, because the presumption is that in terms of structural violence, armed violence is the best solution. And my experience in the field is that's not the case. But that's, again, one limited view. It's very complicated, and I think it's a conversation worth having. And I think it's not enough time in the short panel to even engage in it, really. I think this should be something we should be talking about more seriously on a longer term.
First of all, thank you for all of your thoughts. It was wonderful. So I've been involved for a lot of years in different interfaith work, community engagement. I would say the vast emphasis has been on finding the common ground. And I'm just curious, what role do you, I mean, that's predominantly what happens. So what role do you feel that plays in this peace, finding this peace? And then as suggested, if this peaceful tension is an important part as well, how do you suggest we move events and groups and things like that towards some of that engagement in a way that can be, I don't know, I hear it and I say, that sounds great, but it also sounds scary. So can you give a practical example of how you can move some of that conversation into some of those more tension-filled moments while it's also building on the relationship, I guess. Does that make any sense?
My fundamental slice of reality to me is social psychology, right? So we can look at all sorts of disciplines, what we focus on, that's where I come from. And so the fear, the scariness is very real, right? So what do you have in our society today, a pluralistic society like ours, what's happening? Well, people are scared, so their assumption is we can't be whole with each other. We only can talk about areas where we are always looking around. What does that word mean to? And all of a sudden, we're in this isolation, weird isolation, in a time when we should be able to theoretically, be real, authentic. It's going the other way. And so, the answer, I think, is to teach our children. It starts there, and it starts in our homes. To encourage them to argue with you, to encourage them to say things that would challenge you, right? And then in your response go, wow, that's interesting, Wow, do you realize that could be, that kind of hurts me? And in other words, as quickly as you can, assume good faith in the other party, and then get into the question of what's going on. If you move immediately to assume that the person is an antagonist, it's already almost too late, because the antagonist moves quickly into enemy, and it's scary. If you have a model in your mind, generally a model in your mind, and on the left is enemy, and on the right is friend. What we need, according to William Connolly, is in the middle, agonist. Agonist can move toward enemies, and antagonist really wants to hurt you. And ally on the other side. It's interesting. An ally is only a temporary condition, right, where you're aligned. But a friend can put up with you, even with your deep differences, right? And so we need to see each other as, at the same time, friends and agonists, potential antagonists. And if we can teach our kids that it's up to them to give the other person initially the benefit of the doubt. They disagree with me sincerely, as I am sincere in my disagreement. So they're agonists, but they're not necessarily So the courage I need is to take that trust out there and be vulnerable. Teach courage, in other words. It's all about social, psychological courage we call it mutual openness, where you are open to speak to another person what you really believe, including what might be offensive, and be open to them influencing you the same way. That can be scary because you don't know where it's going to go. But that's the only hope, I think, is to not know where we're going to go, not have it scientifically fixed, and that's scary. Any more? No. I come up with pat answers.
One last quick question, if we've got one.
Do you believe that there's any kind of biological component to humans seeing a propensity for violence in the world? And do you think that any human person is or is not innately violent, and that they could or could not be taught like an idealistic version of this sort of ignition in our adversaries you talked about, or nonviolence?
You take it first. I have another pat answer.
That's like an impossible question to answer in a minute. It's a great question. Human beings are capable of violence and aggression. I don't know that armed conflict is innate to our biological reality, but that's a different question than the human propensity towards aggression. It's about managing or challenging aggression. That's the issue. I mean, much of structural violence and structural forms of violence are about social and political structures, and those aren't innate, those are created by human beings. These are systems, and so they can be addressed and challenged. And I don't think that our biology prevents us from doing that. That's one short answer.
Yes, quickly. Very quick. I think we're human beings are. Evidence keeps showing how that we are evolving, right? Whatever the biology is, it's evolving, and the DNA can be influenced by culture, right? And so to reduce it to saying we're innately anything, to me, leaves out the dynamic reality of humanity. We are becoming something, and we are becoming, according to what I observe, pragmatically less violent if we're trying to accomplish our personal goals. It's a pragmatic reality that I think we can show in the world today, both at the social and the personal level. We have therapies at the personal level, right? Whether it's religion or you're on the couch, it's a therapy. You're trying to create something that's less violent. Or at the international level, we have peacekeepers, we have UNs. We're trying to do things to limit it. So I think the trend, I don't think Martin Luther King was right that the trend is toward justice, but I do think the trend is toward less what we would call violence and more persuasion in terms of human life. I don't think that does away with the contest that will always be there.
Thank you. Please join me in thanking our panelists.